Emperor Augustus had only one kid, and that child was Julia the Elder. This presented a difficulty for the monarch who aspired to establish a dynasty in their realm. He devoted his entire life to the city of Rome and spent his entire life working to restore it. What other means are there to make sure that his efforts were not in vain? Augustus could choose any successor he wanted to inherit his throne through Julia. It may be one of her 3 spouses or any of her many sons. She has a lot of them. Julia, on the other hand, was the antithesis of a submissive daughter or a faithful wife. Julia the Elder, born of a wrong mother. Augustus had 3 different wives throughout his life, but there was only one woman who held that place in his heart. Scribonia, his second wife, was a political match that was used to solidify an alliance between Sextus Pompeius and the triumvirate that was in power at the time. As a result of the fact that Scribonia was connected to Sextus, Augustus, who was known as Octavian at the time, got a divorce from his first wife, Claudia, and had Scribonia get a divorce from her husband. This took place in the year 40 BCE. The marriage was a miserable one all around. Later on, in the note that he sent to Scribonia requesting a divorce, Augustus stated that he could no longer put up with Scribonia's shrewish disposition. In the middle of the 2nd year following their wedding, Scribonia gave birth to the couple's sole child, Julia. The notice of divorce was delivered to her on the very same day. Octavian no longer required her assistance, and by this time he had already developed romantic feelings for Livia, who would eventually become his 3rd wife. He had no way of knowing at the time that Scribonia's child would be the only child he would ever have. But despite this, while he was driving the mother away, he cheerfully accepted the infant. Livia, the evil stepmother? There was no way for Julia to have recalled her biological mother. Soon after Augustus and Livia's divorce, they got wedded in a scandalous manner. As soon as Livia entered into Augustus's household, she immediately assumed responsibility for Julia, Augustus's infant daughter. What kind of a relationship did these 2 women have with one another? The majority of historical sources from antiquity agree that Livia despised her stepdaughter and actively sought ways to undermine and harm her. However, the ancient authors depend on Tacitus an excessive amount of the time. And Tacitus had a strong dislike for Livia. To him, she embodied everything that was nefarious. She was the malevolent of Roman mythology and legend. However, there is a possibility that there is some truth to it. Why are all of the stepmothers in the fairy tales so wicked to begin with? Because they cared deeply about the success of their own children. And Livia was eager to promote the hobbies that her sons had as well. Drusus and Tiberius were Livia's kids from her first marriage, which ended in divorce. They did not leave their father's side until he passed away in the year 36 BCE. After that, the 2 boys were reunited with their mother, and Julia was also brought back together with them. Julia's childhood on the Palatine. Julia spent her childhood in a lavish house on the Palatine Hill, which offered sweeping views of Rome. Her stepmother Livia wielded a strong influence over the enormous household that she oversaw. It's possible that she got along well with her stepbrothers when they were younger. Tiberius was an older brother, and Drusus was approximately the same age as she was. We have no information regarding her relationship with the latter, but it is likely that the 2 of them got along well. Drusus was liked and respected by the vast majority of people. Tiberius, though, was a whole different story. He had an attitude problem, preferred his own company, and was a voracious reader. Augustus had low regard for his older stepson, thinking of him as slow and rough. The information provided by some sources leads us to conclude that Julia the Elder developed feelings for her older brother. As soon as she reached the age of majority, her parents began making plans for her wedding. Due to the fact that she was the only child of the emperor and so extremely valuable, she was not given the option to choose her own spouse. Who exactly would she marry, though? Julia's first marriage, Marcellus, the crown prince of Rome. When Augustus was looking for an heir, he did not take into account Livia's boys. He looked to a member of his own family for assistance, a person who has Julian blood running through their veins. And there was a large pool of candidates to select from as a result of the presence of yet another powerful woman in Rome. One who held a great deal of esteem in the eyes of the Roman populace. Octavia, Augustus's loving sister, was known for her meekness and humility. Marcellus, her older son, was the one that Augustus chose to succeed him as his heir. The union between Marcellus and Julia was legalized. They were close in age to one another, and they had been friends for their entire lives. We have a limited understanding of Marcellus's personality. Seneca has left behind a description of himself stating that he was intelligent, talented, even-tempered, and had decent manners. Could it be that the two young individuals were able to communicate and reach a mutual understanding with one another? That's a possibility. However, they were only granted a year or two of time to complete the task at hand. The royal prince became ill and passed away in the year 23 BCE, leaving behind no children. Julia's second marriage, Agrippa, the leader of Rome. At the age of 16, Julia the Elder lost her husband to death. She was forced to submit to her father's demands and marry a man selected by her paternal grandfather once more. It was Marcus Vipsanius. Augustus's friendship with Agrippa spanned his entire life. He was an expert in various forms of martial arts as well as administrative work. Agrippa was largely responsible for Augustus's success in battle. Ancient records suggest that there was a rivalry between the young crown prince and the veteran general as long as Marcellus was alive, and Augustus favored him as an heir. During this time, Marcellus was alive, and Augustus favored him as an heir. Augustus found himself in need of his old friend when Marcellus passed away. By arranging a marriage between Agrippa and his one and only daughter Julia, he made it clear that Agrippa was the second man in Rome. Was there joy in the marriage? Agrippa was over 2 decades older than she was, a well-known general with a temperament that could be described as harsh. Julia the Elder had a high level of education, was gregarious, and was outgoing. She adored getting together with poets and going to parties. Their interests seemed to be completely different from one another, based on what we know of Agrippa. In either case, Julia was forced to spend a significant amount of time on her own in Rome, while her husband participated in several operations across the empire. However, they were parents to 5 children. 2 daughters, Julia and Agrippina the Elder, as well as 3 boys, Gaius, Lucius, and Agrippa, who was given the name Posthumus due to the fact that he was born after his father had passed away. How obedient Julia was as a wife and daughter. Agrippa spent a great deal of time away. Even while she was married to her husband, Julia may have had other lovers, according to the accounts of several ancient authors. Macrobius offers us very specific and interesting descriptions of Julia. It was continually drilled into her head that every child is an exact reflection of their own father. She would make the gesture of pointing to her stomach and explain, "I take on passengers only when the boat is full." In other words, she only cheated on her husband while she was pregnant in order to avoid having a child with him that was not a product of their marriage. Macrobius also states that the Roman populace had a great deal of affection for Julia the Elder and portrays her as having a friendly personality. Despite the fact that Augustus would not hesitate to use her as a pawn in dynastic politics, it is said that he loved her very much and was willing to forgive her when she did not behave as a virtuous Roman woman would have. Julia was not cruel, but more significantly, she had no interest in politics and had no involvement in the community. She did a lot of reading and particularly liked poetry. She was the antithesis of her stepmother, who was ambitious and exemplified the ideal of a perfect Roman wife. She represented a parallel to her stepmother. Julia's third and final marriage, Tiberius. Agrippa passed away unexpectedly in the year 12 BCE when he was 51 years old. After giving birth to their 5th child, Agrippa Posthumus, Julia lost her husband for the second time when she was 27 years old. She did not remain a single woman for an extended period of time, despite the fact that she was still stunning and vibrant. Augustus took custody of her older sons, Gaius and Lucius, and raised them as his own. He ultimately decided to name them as his heirs. However, they were merely young boys, and Augustus had long since passed the stage of becoming a young man. Therefore, it was necessary for him to locate an older and more experienced guy to serve as his second in command. Finally, he addressed his stepson Tiberius, who was a bit older. He forced him to get a divorce from his cherished wife Vipsania and marry Julia, but the marriage ended up being a complete disaster. Although there may have been a brief period of bliss at the beginning of their existence together when a child was born, the child would soon pass away, as was common for children in ancient times. Tiberius decided to leave his wife and move to Rhodes in the year 6 BCE, rather than return to Rome to continue his career in the Roman administration. The marriage broke up, and Julia found herself back in the position of being on her own. Julia's scandal. 9 years passed while Julia spent her life on her own. It is assumed in every historical source that she carried on a number of relationships throughout that time period. However, they derive this mostly from the occurrences that took place in the year 2 BCE. Her way of life was very different from the paradigm of a virtuous Roman woman, which Augustus and Livia, Augustus's own wife, fiercely promoted as a model for Roman women to aspire to. Julia hosted a number of parties for her friends, during which she behaved in a carefree manner, drank a lot of wine, and drank a lot of alcohol. That much can be said with certainty. But Augustus had to have been aware of it. Since he was extremely knowledgeable about everything that occurred in Rome, it is difficult to believe that he was unaware of the scandalous activities that took place in his daughter's life. But in the year 2 BCE, Julia the Elder did something that was morally wrong. Julia the Elder and her male and female companions are said to have gotten extremely drunk, traveled to the Forum Romanum, and then partied on the rostra. This is according to certain accounts. Regardless of what the truth was, the bubble eventually popped. The response from Augustus was prompt and severe. Both his daughter and his daughter's lovers were punished, and then his daughter was sent to the remote island of Pandateria. It was a rock that was surrounded by the water on all sides. The emperor prohibited her from having male company or drinking alcohol, and he had to provide his personal approval for any visit she made. Did Julia conspire against her father? Adulteresses were typically sentenced to life in exile as their form of punishment. In contrast to the ancient texts, however, more information may be found in modern sources. They make reference to treason. At least one of Julia's acquaintances and lovers was put to death for treasonous acts during her reign. Marcus Antonius, a longtime adversary of Augustus, gave birth to his son Julius Antonius. Octavia, the emperor's sister, was responsible for the boy's upbringing in the imperial household. Yet he was never honored for his service and was discouraged from participating in politics. Iulus Antonius, according to the testimony of Cassius Dio, was put to death. Some modern historians are adamant that the penalty and treatment that Augustus meted out to Antonius and Julia's other lovers was excessively severe for the crime of common adultery. If we put the issue into its proper perspective, we won't need to hunt for a conspiracy, even though it's possible that there was some conspiring involved. Augustus enacted groundbreaking family laws and went to tremendous efforts to see that they were followed. This so-called Lex Iulii sought to correct the loose morals of young people in upper-class families in order to create a virtue-filled family life that was blessed with a large number of offspring. What was he supposed to do when his own daughter publicly disapproved of the changes that her father had made? The behavior of Julia may have been used as an example to serve as a warning, and the behavior of Augustus would signal to all mothers and fathers that regardless of how much they love their daughters and spouses, they should discipline them appropriately if they feel it is necessary to do so. Therefore, Julia was active in her father's political career once again. Julia the Elder, Exile, and Death. The landmass known as Pandateria was really just a rocky outcrop in the water. Julia the Elder spent her days here until her father reduced the severity of her punishment and gave her permission to travel to Rhegium, which was located on the mainland. He was kind enough to let her biological mother to accompany her during the process. The fact that these two women had never met before makes it impossible to know what they discussed during their conversation. Julia's predicament became even more dire after Augustus died, and Tiberius was proclaimed emperor. Tiberius deprived her of her income and prevented her to go outside the house during their relationship. Her passing occurred in 14 CE. Was there anything left behind by Augustus's disobedient daughter? Her lasting contribution to history is the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Her grandson Caligula eventually succeeded her as ruler of Rome after her husband Tiberius's death. Her great-grandson, who would later become the last emperor of the line, was named Nero. Julia the Elder is the reason that the first dynasty of Roman emperors is known as the Julio-Claudians, despite the fact that she may have finished her life in shame, regardless of how things turn out. We hope you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.